Good evening. Thank you for attending the December 16th, 2024 meeting of the Westerville City Schools Board of Education. This evening's agenda will be displayed on the screens in the front of the room. Printed agendas are on the table in the back, or you may find the agenda on your mobile device by connecting to the district's website at www.wcsoh.org. Click on our district link, select Board of Education, and follow the board docs link to our current meeting agenda. There will be two opportunities to address the board before we enter into executive session. There are sign-up sheets located on the table in the back of the room. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to address the board. A timer will be shown on the screen. And with that, Ms. Marshall, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Davidson?
Here.
Mrs. Lebian?
Here.
Mrs. Valentine?
Here.
Mrs. Altman?
Here.
Mrs. Meyer?
Here. Would you please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We have no district highlights tonight. So next up is the superintendent's comments. Ms. Hamburg.
Okay. All right, thank you. I wanted to provide an update. Since our levy failure on November 5th, our team has been busy working. We've worked with our administrative team to eliminate $4.8 million from our budgets for this current year, and then looking ways to sustain and or increase that as we move forward into future years. So I just want to share what some of those items are that we pulled out of the budgets this year. We looked at some of the contracted services or repairs that typically are in our general fund. We are postponing a K-5 math curriculum adoption and using our current materials along with our special education math curriculum adoption. We are reducing professional development opportunities, reducing purchases of other instructional materials and supplies such as textbooks, magazines, et cetera, for media centers. We are reducing the amount of instructional software that we have available. We have some unfilled school resource officer positions that the police department hasn't been able to fill yet that we are going to not fill for the remainder of this year. And then we'll want to have some dialogue about whether or not we would want to fill them moving forward as we look at future rounds here. We're looking at other non-instructional materials and supplies. So we have been under budget for fuel, so we were able to reduce that line. We're able to defer replacement of our access control cards that we had planned to replace, those types of materials. We have other, I mentioned some of the professional technical services, so looking at like design services for projects, making sure that all those are coming out of our permanent improvement fund versus a general fund. Looking at software like Cronus that we use with our routing software for our buses, moving that out, postponing, replacing some of that, and some additional work that we have been doing with aligning our policies with Ohio Revised Code and looking at some of the contracted services around helping us align that, reducing those services. Not purchasing as many of our technology devices as we had planned, and then postponing replacement of audiovisual equipment in the schools. So those were some of the areas that, and again, I would just say with the timing of the year, there were some things that had already been spent that as we look at moving forward, those may be different savings that we're able to actualize as we go into those other school years. And I'll pause there to see if you have any questions on that.
Just to be clear, so some of those are reductions in spending that are likely to be able to be carried forward, and some of them are really delaying.
Correct.
Right, so
Yep.
they will have to come up at some point.
Yes. So for example, The math curriculum, we think we can wait until 2031 for the
Okay.
elementary math curriculum. At that point, the current edition that we're using would be out of print, so the subscriptions and software for that, we wouldn't be able to continue to support. And I think with the caveat too, as we look especially at our curricular materials, that everything we're deciding obviously is always based on the information we have at the time, and we know that things change quite frequently. So, for example, we've talked multiple times in here about the science of reading requirements for our literacy materials. So the state has required that we have certain materials that meet the requirements on a list of approved vendors that can provide materials for science of reading instruction. Our K-2 materials are already in compliance, our 3-5 ones are not, so we do need to move forward with that purchase. But the math as of now is not a requirement. Now, that could be something next year, they could come in with a requirement that whatever we have in math doesn't meet some type of requirement. So that is always, everything we do obviously is always, at the mercy of legislative changes or other requirements that we have. So based on the information we have now, we're still working through and looking at, what else can we, so if some of those things we're able to put out of this 5-year forecast and use what we have. Typically, we have a cycle where we evaluate how materials are doing and look, if there's something that we think would be better. But unless the standards are changing, we're looking at can we use those longer and kind of push those cycles out a little bit, as an example.
Thanks.
That was yours too? Okay. Any other questions?
Just is it correct then that even if we are required by the General Assembly to change some of our curriculum, we aren't given additional funding to be able to do that? We have to use our own funding to be able to change that curriculum to come in alignment with the law.
That's typically the case, and I think I might have said that backwards. So just to clarify, our K-2 is what needs replaced. Our 3-5 is currently, okay. I think I might have said that backwards. So just to clarify that. So we did get some money, for example, when the state, and I think we've mentioned this before, but just to remind folks, when the state came out with the science of reading requirements, we did get some money as a pass-through to pay stipends to our teachers for mandatory training that they have to do, but that was not to cover the actual materials themselves. So we did see money to help with that requirement. We are required to pay, all teachers have to have that training, some level of it depending on what they teach. And so we did get stipends, but the materials themselves we are required to pay for. And I would anticipate if there are other, like a math change would probably be similar.
Yeah, I just want to mention, as the state moves things around, they're just continuing to decrease our funding instead of giving us additional funds pretty much every step of the way, so.
And I know Nicole did a nice job with the 5-year forecast of pointing that out, but there's an example where if you look, it looks like we got a little more than they initially said in our state funding, but in a restricted funding, but it was actually the pass-through of those stipends for the teachers. So it didn't give us any additional funding we could use toward actually implementing that.
I just want to highlight that this is just the beginning, make sure people understand that this is just a start.
Yep, so that's a good segue. Just to kind of give an update, so we talked at the last meeting about looking at some Tier 1 reductions, which would be things that we would recommend with most of those items, looking at being ongoing items. And so we are working with our team to look at ways that we can reduce and restructure our district level positions, including our administration. We have 2 negotiations this year with 2 of our associations, WA and WESA, and then we also have our admin wage and benefit guidelines, so starting to work on those. Already talked about the budget reductions, which includes, as I mentioned, subscriptions, technology, deferring purchases, et cetera. We are looking at what would be the impact if we would minimally in this Tier 1 increase any type of fees that we have. So those would potentially could be pay to participate, course fees, or general fees. So getting that information together to share with the board for a discussion. We've already recommended, and Nicole's already looked at doing, eliminating our turf fund transfer. So In the past, we have turf at our 3 high schools, so we had put $65,000 a year, so that could build up. So looking at taking all that out of permanent improvement funds. Also looking at, what are the other items that we're able to move to our permanent improvement fund and take out of the general fund. So we have things like bus purchases, technology purchases, and obviously then as we look at our roof replacement, our HVAC and those types of expenses, definitely reduces what we're able to do in terms of those projects, in terms of what's left. Looking at reducing some staff in this round, including through attrition, which would have some impact on core instruction, student choice, and student supports, limited at that Tier 1 level. Looking at potentially reducing the scope for Summer Learning Academy. So right now, we're looking at, what are we required to do? We have to do the preschool component because we are required to start educating our preschoolers when they turn 3. And so that includes if they turn 3 in the summer. So we've been able to meet that requirement through our summer programming. Also looking at some of our courses that have fees, so that will be something that we'll bring as a topic of conversation. Looking at reducing some of our supplemental offerings, so we have a lot of different clubs and activities, so looking at putting together the numbers of what those different offerings cost. Continuing to review our transportation for efficiencies, so I will tell you, right now we have we're already down 7 to 9 bus drivers from the time the day starts, just because of shortages where we can't fill positions and some people being out on leaves. So when we look at routing differently, it would be more us being able to staff everything, but then also not needing as many routes. If we don't need as many routes, we don't need to replace as many buses. Buses are over $150,000 a piece now, the maintenance on those, it's more of that type of expense that we would be able to save out of the general fund. And then, as we mentioned before, we are examining pretty much every facet of the organization, so I'm sure there are other things that don't fit into those general categories as we kind of work through. So we're planning on making a recommendation that we move the organizational meeting up. We've talked to somebody about this, but just to let folks know. Move the organizational meeting up to January 6th, have some of our regular agenda items on there, which would open up then the 13th for us to be able to have a more in-depth conversation. With the holidays in there, just need a little extra time to pull some of that information together so that we can have some good dialogue. Any questions on that or anything any additional information at this point that would be helpful? Okay, so again, we'll be working on that and we'll plan on having some conversation in January. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, moving along, may I have a motion to approve the minutes of the regular Board of Education meeting held on Monday, November 25th of 2024?
So moved.
Second.
Any comments, questions? All right, would you please take the vote?
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Lieband,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. Next, we have public comments, and the Board of Education welcomes public comment on educational issues of interest to our school community. The board does not discriminate based on the identity or viewpoint of the speaker during our public participation. However, the board president may limit comments that are obscene, abusive, or harassing. In any attempt to protect the privacy interests of our students, the board asks that speakers not identify students by name during their comments. Persons having public complaints about district personnel, programming, or operations will be referred to the process set forth in Board Policy 9130. Finally, the board reminds speakers that their statements should be directed to the board as a whole and not to individual board members. Public comments offered at this point on the agenda are reserved for comments relative to agenda items 7.01 to 11.05. Again, each speaker will have 5 minutes to address the board. A timer will be shown on the screen, and Mr. Doran will call time when 5 minutes has elapsed. Our first speaker this evening is Mr. Doug Krinsky. Welcome.
Thank you. First thing I want to start off with is what I just heard. I'm happy to hear. I know everybody sitting up there probably isn't as excited as I might be, but I do appreciate what you're doing, 7.01 and 7.02. I do hope you do pass because I think it's important for those kinds of changes for the district, and I think they're both good moves. I don't see on the agenda, although I saw it a couple days ago, I'm not sure if it's still there or not, maybe it's buried somewhere, but on the public comments section that you're proposing to change. So just a little bit of feedback on that. Right now, it is 5 minutes, going to 3 minutes. I'm not sure what the purpose of that serves. So I would, again, go back to 5 minutes, just leave it there. Second part is, must be a resident to speak. I think you miss out on opportunities of having experts come to speak on various topics, state representatives, state senators, and various, nonprofit folks that may want to come in and speak without having the ability to have a resident to be able to speak. I think you miss opportunities there. So again, I would leave it the way that it is. And on the 60-minute time limit, again, I'm not sure why that would be in there. I think as many people that want to speak should be given that opportunity. I know you can make an adjustment, or you're proposing to make an adjustment if there was that many people that signed up. I just don't see why you need to limit it to begin with. So I would leave the public comment policy the way that it is, 5 minutes, you don't have to be a resident, and no time limit. And the last thing I would propose, if you're looking to save time, I would limit the presentations that everybody in the district does to the board. Some of these presentations that I've, in the last 6 months, seen go on and on and on and on and on. If you limited what the district personnel presented to 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I think the meetings would move along a lot faster, as opposed to cutting short the public comments. So those are two areas I just wanted to touch base on, public comments, and again, on the 2 at 7 point, I hope you pass them both. Happy holidays. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, moving along. May I have a motion to approve resolution to rescind and close the capital projects fund created on June 10th, 2024?
So moved. Second.
Ms. Marshall? Do you
Yes, so this resolution will allow us to rescind the resolution that was passed on June 10th, 2024. And with that, we'll be able to transfer the funds back to the general operating account. As we've discussed, this ability for us to transfer this exists under Ohio law, and should our plans change, which it has in this case due to the levy failure, we're able to move those funds back. So,
Thank you. Any questions or comments? All right.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Lebian,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. And may I have a motion to amend the fiscal year 2025 annual appropriations?
So moved.
Second.
And Ms. Marshall?
Yes, thank you again. So this will amend, we approved permanent appropriations in September as required by law, and so this is an update to those appropriations. It includes reducing the general fund appropriations with the budget reductions that Ms. Hamburg talked about, and we have other budget allocations and some unspent non-public funds from grants that are being returned back to the state as we're required to track all of that. And then we're also adding the, eliminating the appropriation for the $30 million in the capital projects fund, as that's being returned to the general fund.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? All right.
Mrs. Leban,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. And is it okay if I take the personal consent agenda as one? Great. May I have a motion to approve the personal consent agenda 8.01 through 8.11?
So moved. Second.
Welcome, Mr. Cooper.
Good evening, President Meyer, Vice President Altman, members of the board, Ms. Marshall, and Ms. Hamburg. Tonight's personnel consent agenda includes action items with regard to resignations, retirements, leaves of absence, contract status changes, one-time pays, and other employment-related decisions. Additionally, we have one MOU with our WEA and one MOU with our OPC 719 union recommended for your approval. We have one staff member who has announced retirement on this evening's agenda. Kelly Blum will be retiring at the end of the year after 33 years of service to the district. We certainly wish her the best and appreciate all that she's done for our students, staff, and community. The MOU with the WEA relates to replacement contracts for employees who are hired during the current school year. This MOU gives the board flexibility for new hires for positions that are resigned during the year or for a teacher who takes an approved leave of absence for a qualifying reason for the remainder of this school year. The MOU with our OPC 719 provides clarification with regard to extra runs as currently defined in the negotiated agreement. At this time, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Any questions or comments?
No questions. On the extra runs, I just want to thank everybody for, I know
Yep.
people work really hard to cover those extra runs, so really appreciate them. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mrs. Leban?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And is it okay if we take old business as one too? The final readings? Everybody okay? Okay. May I have a motion to approve old business 9.01 through 9.23?
So moved.
Second?
Are there any questions or comments? Okay, yeah. I'm going to talk through all 23 of them. Lightning speed round.
Actually, this is regarding item 24. So as you might have noticed, we pulled the public participation policy 0169.1 from the agenda because we feel like we need to work on the language in item B for who is permitted to speak at our board meeting. So we just wanted to make sure that we stated that so everybody knew where it was. I did share that with Mr. Krinsky before he left because I know he asked about it. So that's it. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
did we receive feedback? Is that why?
We have received some feedback. There are some people who we want to reconsider just before we just put it on, modified the language. Some people who might be property taxpayers in our district that we have not included. So we just want to make sure that if you have legitimate interest in Westerville City Schools business, that you should have an opportunity to speak.
Appreciate you doing the extra work on that. Thank you. All right.
Mrs. Leban?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. Next, we have new business. We have the first reading of 2026-2027 academic calendar. And Ms. Dennis, welcome. I'm really excited about this calendar. I don't know about others.
Good evening, President Meyer, members of the board, Ms. Hamburg and Ms. Marshall. Before you tonight is the first reading of the 2026-2027 academic calendar. This calendar was brought before the calendar committee, which is comprised of one member of our community, a parent in the district, along with several representatives from different negotiated bargaining units throughout our district. It received the best support of the options that were in front of them. It does meet the teacher work days along with the student count days as well, and with 3 professional days in there. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
I just appreciate we're not starting in like the second week of August, so thank you so much.
Yes, the first student day, August 18th on that year.
Any questions or comments? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Marshall, will you take the vote? Oh, that's right.
Yep.
I'm on, yeah, okay. So next up, we have the first reading of policy 2265, protections of individual beliefs, affiliations, ideals, or principles of political movements or ideology. Welcome, Mr. Dorn.
Good evening again, President Meyer, Vice President Altman, members of the board. Ms. Hamburg and Ms. Marshall. Presented here is a new policy, Policy 2265, Protections of Individual Beliefs, Affiliations, Ideals, or Principles of Political Movements or Ideology. This policy is required by House Bill 214, which was effective on October 24th. It needs to be approved by January 22nd to meet compliance, so that's why your first reading is tonight, and our second reading will be early in January. This act prohibits the use of statements of comments to or soliciting or requiring specified individuals to affirmatively ascribe to specific beliefs, affiliations, ideals, or principles concerning political movements or ideology. In summary, allowed to have your own beliefs.
Any questions, comments? Okay, thank you. Next up, we have the first reading of policy 5200, attendance, and then the first reading of policy 5500, student conduct. Welcome, Mr. McElwain.
You guys are stuck with me for a couple minutes, sorry. Good evening, Ms. Meyer and Ms. Hamburg, Ms. Marshall, members of the board. It is my absolute pleasure to present to you revisions to Board Policy 5200 for attendance. This policy is recommended for language revisions due to changes within Ohio Revised Code with House Bill 214. Most of the revisions are just some general wording pieces, but there is a specific new requirement for 3 religious expression days each school year for students. So these revisions will make sure that we are now updated with this new mandate and put processes in place that will be then carried over to our handbook. If anyone has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions at this time.
Nope.
Awesome. Did you guys want to do the vote on this one, or do you want me to do
We
the-
don't have, it's our first reading.
First reading, oh, sorry.
I did it too.
Well, let's go into 5500 then with student conduct. This is one where this policy is recommended for changes due to changes in education and changes within technology. We started this kind of conversation with our handbook committee last year, and with the recommendations here from Neola, these are pieces that we need to put in place because as technology evolves and that goes into schools, we need to make sure that our policies evolve as well. So this will help us to guide our students on how to not only use AI in the proper way, but make sure that what they are showing is what they know isn't just AI generated. So this is needed to make sure that we're up to date on current practices and how technology is impacting education.
Yeah, I really appreciate that students will get this opportunity to know how to use it properly. So thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions or comments? All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay. Next, moving to standing business. And may I have a motion to appoint Jen Altman as President Pro Tempore
So
from
moved.
January 1st, 2025 until the election of the next board president on January 6th, 2025.
So moved. Second.
Ms. Marshall?
I hope they asked you first. No, I'm kidding.
We didn't. We just told her that it was voluntold. No, I'm kidding.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Levan,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. Oh, thanks, Jen. May I have a motion to approve the resolution for impracticality of transportation?
So moved.
Second.
Welcome, Mr. Snyder.
Good evening, President Meyer, Vice President Altman, members of the board, Superintendent Hamburg, and Ms. Marshall. Before you this evening is a resolution declaring impracticality to transport identified students, as Ohio law provides and allows for public schools to determine the impracticality of transportation after consideration of several factors such as the cost of providing the transportation and the number of students transported. This past September 9th, 2024, the board passed a resolution declaring 64 students impractical for transportation, and before you today is a list of 13 additional students deemed impractical to transport for the 2024-25 school year. Of note, there is also one additional student identified to be approved for the 23-24 school year due to a school of attendance change from the previous year of 2022-23. Our Department of Purchasing and Logistics has evaluated each listed private school student per the requirements of Section 3327.02 of the Ohio Revised Code and declared the listed students impractical to transport. Therefore, the total of 14 students this evening, approving this resolution would allow the district to offer the payment in lieu of transportation, of which the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce determines the payment in lieu amount. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you may have this evening.
Any questions, comments?
It's just always good to remind people what this means, right? That these students do not attend Westerville City Schools, but they live within our boundaries. And we are required either to transport them to private schools or pay them in lieu of transportation. That's what that payment in lieu of means. So just one of those things that we have to do, and the private schools are not needing to transport their own students. Thanks.
All right. Yep.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Liebing?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the payment in lieu of transportation for the 5 students for the 2023-2024 school year?
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Snyder?
Again, and before you this evening is an additional resolution to approve the payment for 5 students for the 2023-24 school year, and therefore approving this resolution this evening will allow the district to offer the payment in lieu of transportation, rather to make the payment in the manner provided per the Ohio Revised Code at the rate set by the Department of Education and Workforce for the 23-24 school year.
Any questions or comments? Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Liebing?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the out-of-state overnight field trips?
So moved. Second.
Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Baldwin.
Good evening, President Meyer, members of the board, Superintendent Hamburg, and Mrs. Marshall. We have 4 overnight out-of-state field trips for your consideration this evening. 2 are wrestling tournaments this month that include our girls wrestling team participating in a tournament at the University of Findlay and our boys wrestling team competing at the Medina Invitational at Medina High School, and those are both Westerville North teams. And the remaining requests are for our Westerville North baseball and softball teams traveling out of state during spring break. They go for warmer weather, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions? Comments? Just good luck to the wrestlers. All right.
Mrs. Liebing?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the early graduate candidate who has completed all local and state requirements?
So moved.
Second.
The best part. Welcome, Ms.
Good evening again. We're excited to support another one of our students completing their graduation requirements prior to their cohort. And this student will be eligible to complete all of their graduation requirements in January and expects to begin their post-secondary plans upon upon completion of those requirements. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Just congratulations. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Liebing?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. We have no public comments, so moving on to board comments. Who would like to provide some comments?
Well, I just have a few legislative updates that I would like to share. Earlier this week, I submitted written testimony in opposition to a few bills that I believe are impacting Ohio students in schools, and a few of those bills include Senate Bill 295. This bill essentially aims to close or reorganize schools, and I ultimately believe there are multiple avenues to bolster student learning. Closing schools simply is not the answer. Another bill to keep on your radar is House Bill 206. If passed, this bill would allow suspensions up to 180 days. meaning students could face year-long suspensions, ultimately creating an extreme risk for our students and families. There are various other bills to keep on your radar, but those are a few.
Well, I also have a legislative update from Congress. U.S. Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from South Dakota, introduced Senate Bill 5384 titled Returning Education to Our States Act. This bill abolishes the Department of Education and terminates any applicable program for which it has administrative responsibility, except for those programs transferred to other federal agencies. So that means all functions, programs, and authorities under the Department of Education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and each impact aid program will be transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services. Authorities and programs within the Department of Education's Office of Indian Education will be transferred to the Department of Interior. The Department of Treasury will oversee the federal Pell Grant programs, Family Education Loan Program, some other programs, activities described, some student assistance, the Health Education Assistance Loan Program, and all programs under the Education Science Reform Act of 2022 and the Educational Technical Assistance Act. It will also it's also instructed to establish 2 block grant programs to provide allocations to states to support elementary and secondary education, including career and technical education, and support post-secondary education, which I think is really important to understand that impact. So if this would to happen, now granted it was just introduced, it will die in this session because it hasn't had any hearings, but it will likely be reintroduced in the next Congress, would mean that funding would then flow just to the states to establish who gets to have funding, and what that funding number is. And so we know that we continue to be cut, and so this is something that does worry me. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division should be responsible for receiving complaints and enforcing federal civil rights laws that are applicable to these block grant programs and federal student programs. So as I said, it'll need to be reintroduced because the 118th Congress ends on December 31st. If you are concerned about the state of public education in this bill, please contact your U.S. senators and your congressional representative. If you're unclear who those are, you can go to congress.gov/members/find-your-member. That's all I have. Congratulations to the graduate. Anything? Okay. The board will meet in an organizational regular session on Monday, January 26, 2025. What'd I say? Oh, sorry. Just wishing away days, apparently. Gosh. January 6, 2025 at 6 p.m. at the Early Learning Center, 936 East Wind Drive, Westerville, Ohio, 43081, which is here in this building. And now, may I have a motion to enter into executive session for the purposes of discussing the employment and compensation of public employees?
So moved.
Second.
Ms. Marshall?
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Lieband,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes, you're welcome to stay, but you don't have to.
It is 6:40.
Thank you. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
We are adjourned.
I need to
Vote.
Oh, sorry, yes. Gosh.
Mrs. Lieband,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer,
Yes, apparently.
and 13.